this special joint event between the Bell Foundation and NALDIC, the National Association for Language Development in the Curriculum. This is the fifth of a series of webinars which the Bell Foundation will be hosting over the next few weeks for school staff, teacher educators and local authority education teams, as we all face unprecedented challenges while we support the remote learning of our students for as long as lockdown and social distancing measures remain in place. We know that you are under unbelievable pressure. You're very stretched and doing a wonderful job in spite of it. Our aim here is to provide a bridge between practitioners and experts in the field of English as an additional language and a forum for exchanging ideas. Both the indefinite closure of schools in order to stop the spread of coronavirus and the cancellation of exams announced by the Department for Education in England is likely to have an adverse impact on the learning and attainment of many pupils who use English as an additional language. Right now, most EAL pupils are at home working independently on online learning packages, in many cases with limited exposure to a range of good models of English, which is a necessary condition for vocabulary growth and the development of fluency in English to take place. Many of these children lack or have limited access to the kinds of teaching approaches and support best suited to English language development alongside the curriculum. These learning conditions are particularly demanding for pupils who are new to English or in the early acquisition stages, and those who entered late into the UK education system. And the disadvantage is even greater for those children whose parents do not speak any English or who have low levels of proficiency in English. However, we can take steps to mitigate against this, and today's panel of experts is here to help with practical suggestions on supporting the learning of EAL pupils during and after school closures and answer questions posed by you. Before I introduce the panel, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure of this webinar. It is primarily a question and answer session. So first of all, each member of the panel will speak for 2 minutes to provide key messages from their area of expertise. Then we'll move on to questions from the audience, which I will collect and pose to the panel. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Don't wait until the end of the 2 minutes. You can pose questions as and when you want to pose them. Please confine your questions to today's topic and the areas covered by the panel. The speakers are not here representing the government, so obviously they won't be able to comment on government policy. And of course, none of us know, for example, the answer to when lockdown will end. We would also welcome your ideas and practical suggestions, so please feel free to add these to the chat box when they occur to you. The webinar will end with a closing statement from each of the speakers. Enough of me. I am delighted to introduce the panel. Dr. Naomi Flynn is here representing NALDIC and the University of Reading and will focus on EAL for primary education. Kamil Czewiatowski from the Bell Foundation will focus on EAL for secondary education. Dr. Yvonne Foley for NALDIC and Edinburgh University will focus on EAL for initial and continuing teacher education, and Professor Constant Lung from NALDIC and King's College London will focus on EAL assessment. Before we begin, just a quick comment on why you will see the speakers one at a time, and this is to try and avoid streaming 4 or 5 videos so that the quality of your experience is better. So the speakers will appear one at a time when it's their turn to speak. Thank you very much. Naomi, would you like to kick us off?
I certainly would. Thanks very much, Silvana. I'm just going to change my microphone because I think you're getting a weird one.
You're all right.
How's that?
It's perfect.
I'm okay. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Bell Foundation for inviting NALDIC to join forces with us for a second webinar. It's great to be part of this ongoing collective effort in these unprecedented times, and it's brilliant to see 279 and rising of you here today. Thank you. In our last webinar, which you can watch on YouTube, we concentrated on support on school lockdown very much, but today I want to be talking towards return to school as well. However, in many ways, any advice that I give about primary schools and EAL teaching and learning won't change, and it's based very much on what Yvonne Foley referred to last time as an array of pedagogies that teachers need to support their EAL learners. So to reconfirm my elements of great research-informed effective practice for primary school children with EAL, that is that it should consider children's current level of proficiency in English and where they need to go next as a starting point. It should use home languages wherever possible. It should be talk-based and a conversational route into literacy and into conceptual understanding into subjects outside English, because subject knowledge really matters as well. It should focus on vocabulary development, that's breadth of vocabulary, how many words do I know, and depth of vocabulary, how do I know how to use those words. It should make things visual and concrete, and it should draw on children's experiences both in school and at home to give a clear and meaningful context for learning. In terms of resources today, I'll still be suggesting that you access the NALDIC blog resources for EAL in lockdown, which the link will appear to you at the end of this presentation. And I'm also going to be naming some that come recommended from the EAL Mesh Guide, and Silvana has the link for that. The EAL Mesh Guide is something I wrote with Sarah Coles and Chris Pym of Hampshire MTAS, and it's an online resource which, as well as having advice from us in it, also has links to other resources that we like. And teachers often say to me, I don't know which EAL resources online are good ones, and I don't have time to find out which are good ones. So that's what hopefully we've done for you within that resource, and we'll be signposting some of those today. So look forward to talking with you later.
Thank you very, very much, Naomi. Over to you, Camille, for EAL for secondary education.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be able to be here again, and thank you so much for turning up in such huge numbers. So I'm speaking from a secondary perspective, and I think it's still those three aspects that appear to be the most important when we're thinking about our actions. So the first one is that we should ensure that learners continue to be exposed to good English language model throughout this time, and that's what Naomi has just said as well. So when at home, learners will be communicating with their family members in their first language, and however, less or very little exposure to the English language through the curriculum, which is the content and language teaching approach. This is likely to impact on those learners' attainment in progress and their life chances down the line. So now there is a large number of apps and websites that you could use to help here. No doubt you're already using online conferencing tools in your schools, but there are more interactive tools as well, mobile device tools that we can use to our advantages this time. There's one resource that I would like to mention. It's called the Pedagogy Wheel. That's PAD, pedagogy, not PED. And that's a very useful tool, which basically links Bloom's taxonomy, so your educational objectives, to actual mobile apps. There's one for Android and there's one for iPad, and that's something that might be very, very useful to us. And then secondly, having said that, we need to remember that the first languages that our EAL learners speak are very important. So there are various established links between development and maintenance of the first language and faster second language acquisition. So we need to remember about that as well. And this also means if we encourage the parents of our learners, that they can be more easily involved whilst they're at home in their children's learning. And finally, we need to think about Band A learners, and so the learners who are brand new to English. And communication with these learners and their families might be more difficult, particularly at this time. It's important to remember that all skills, listening, speaking, reading, and viewing and writing, need to be supported, although perhaps it is easier at this time to assign writing tasks to the learners. And finding ways. So it is important to find ways to for learners brand new to English to listen to English content and communicate in speech. And many of us will know that practicing talk leads to better writing. So those would be my three pieces of advice that I would share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Camo. Yvonne, would you like to give us your perspective on teacher education, please? Yvonne? Yes.
Sorry, it was very slow there. Hi, I'm Yvonne Foley, and a part of my work is supporting student teachers and in-service teachers in how to develop the literacies that are needed for EAL pupils in schools. And I think part of the thing that I'd like to talk about with you today, as we look at these challenging times that we're in, is to emphasize the need for, no matter which platform we're in or which educational space we find ourselves in, that there are certain principles that are important to the teaching and learning of English as an additional language. And part of the work I do with teachers in schools and in university is looking at how literacies develop and how these are how these travel across borders, how we help our practices and our pedagogies to travel across linguistic borders, cultural borders, and social borders in order to support students in their understanding and engagement with text. And so part of the thing that I'd be interested in sharing today is about looking for authentic dialogues and developing activities with authentic dialogues that encourage this type of engagement with text. And that's not just for younger learners. And one of the areas that I'll explore and give you some insights into is looking at picture books, and that's for younger learners in primary, but it's also for secondary students and pupils too. And so it's looking at how we then engage with these texts to promote critical questioning with pupils, how we help them to see that they can have a voice and how they engage with text, that not everything they read in a text is true. And it allows us to help student teachers and teachers in schools to start their practices with considering difference rather than the norm that we perceive everybody should be following within our classroom text. So we're looking at educating for society, and it's helping them to promote a narrative of freedom and to look for identities within the text as they engage in the learning process. So part of that and the pedagogies that are with that are visually supported. It's helping learners notice differences between first language and second language. It's encouraging the use of first language as you engage with text. It's about recycling language and how you help learners to think about, or teachers to think about how they can continually recycle learning activities or the vocabulary words that are needed in order to engage with specific text that they're using. So as Naomi has mentioned, talk-based approaches are a pathway into literacy development in that way, and very much discovery approaches help us to engage with the discourses that surround us. So some of the activities and things we'll talk about today are linked to those kind of overarching principles.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yvonne. Now, last but not least, Constant Lung on assessment. Constant, can you please turn the camera on and the mic on so that we can see and hear you? Constant, your mic seems to be off. Now your mic is on. That's great. We'll wait until your camera is on. If you want to start speaking, Constant, that's
Hello,
great.
everybody.
We will see you in a yeah.
Slow in coming. Okay, thank you. I think if anything at all, we're learning at least two things. One is looking at all the messages and all the questions. It seems to me that one of the common problems underlying all the questions and all the queries and all the teacher concerns is the fact that there's relatively little built-in EAL facility and expertise in lots of schools. So we are in a kind of free-fall situation when something like this happens. And as a result, we are all scrambling to respond to the contingencies. So looking just...
Constant, apologies, I'm interrupting because you sound a little bit quiet. Is there anything you can do about your volume? Thank you. Your mic is off now. You seem to have frozen, Constant. Can you try speaking? Okay, we'll wait for one more minute, and if we can't get Constant back, we'll start with the first question and then come back to Constant. Constant, can you hear us?
Is it better?
Excellent, much better.
Right, okay. I don't know where we were then. Simply to say that one of the important things from learning from this, current crisis is that, generally speaking, schools are not very well endowed with EAL provision in terms of staffing and in terms of curriculum. And so we find ourselves in this kind of emergency where for EAL is a kind of free-fall situation. There's nothing to fall back on that much. So looking just beyond the immediate period, I think all of us, as teachers and as researchers and as people working in universities and charitable organizations, must redouble our effort to make sure that EAL is put back on the curriculum as a proper part of the school curriculum offer. That's the first thing to say. Second thing, more immediately, is I think the lack of effective communication in the various community languages to the parents could also be a contributing factor to a lot of the questions and the anxieties brought to our attention by the teachers. And so that's really part of, if you like, thinking about EAL as a proper subject provision. Working with the parents, working with the communities, and we need the language interpretation and translation aspect of that to be put in place from here on. And the final point to make is particularly in relation to the OPPO and government's decision to abandon the GCSE and A-levels this year and turn to teacher assessment as a way of giving a mark or marks for the students. This actually is likely to be a very important part of what we do in school for the next period, apart from the very useful educational purposes that teacher assessment can serve. The record-keeping side of it would put us in a very good position so that we, in future, should anything like this, not just something to do with this kind of natural, as it were, contingency, but other things such as teachers leaving, new teachers coming in, record transfer and so on. If we develop a very systematic school-based teacher assessment framework and practice, then we would be in a much better place for both supporting the learning of the children as well as reporting what they can do in any kind of eventuality. So those are the kind of key points that I think I would very happy to emphasize. And I will respond to some specific questions arising from the teachers' questions when I'm given the turn by Silvana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constant. There are still a few issues with your sound, so now our technical support will be working with you while we ask the other speakers. So thank you. Moving on to the questions. There are two sets of questions this afternoon. Some of you have sent your questions in advance of today's webinar, and some of you are posting questions now. So I'm going to start with a few of the questions that have been sent by you in advance. And I'm going to start with Naomi, a few for you. One from Salma, who's asking, what is the best way to motivate and monitor an EAL learner whose parents are not English speakers or computer literate?
Hello, Salma, and thanks for your question. There's no one answer to you for this. There's not a best way. It's a really difficult thing to be dealing with, and it's a really difficult thing to be dealing with in lockdown. And I think that schools will be able to offer this in different ways and at different levels of success depending on their own circumstances. What I can share with you is advice from one school with 98% EAL learners and many, many languages that I work with very closely and know well. And what they're doing is they're making sure that messages that are going home during lockdown mirror messages that would go down during normal times. So they're using an app called Marvellous Me. They're using children's homework books that families are accustomed to. So there's this consistency of approach from school into lockdown, where they really do need to. They're also going out into the community as far as possible to take messages. I realise that's incredibly time intensive and also can only be done with social distancing, but they are doing things like that. Where they're not going out to parents, they're answering questions on email and on phones, so they're making themselves available to families. They're also using community members, things like community radio stations, to get messages across in the many languages that the school has. And finally, teachers are making short YouTube videos via a private channel where they model new concepts related to the learning that they're sending home. And in terms of that motivation that you're talking about, both for the child and for the parents, that can be great, because seeing your teacher's face online, even though you're miles away from them or you feel very distant from them, can really help. And I know from my own students at Reading that where we're doing things online for them and we're doing actual podcasts where they actually see us, that somehow makes a huge difference, that kind of almost a sense of social contact, across the airwaves, as it were. So I hope that's helpful for you.
Thank you. A question from Pinda. At the best of times, it is difficult to provide support for EAL children and parents at school, as there are many languages and a lot of parents are unable to read or write even in their own home language. So the question is, how can we support parents and children at home to access the curriculum, making sure they do not lag behind?
Okay, Pinda, that's like a big question with like many sub-questions. They're going to take it a little bit at a time. So firstly, let's talk about that term you use, lag behind, and remind ourselves that it takes approximately 2 years for children to become conversationally fluent in English and more like 5 to 7 years for them to become proficient in academic English, the vocabulary and concepts belonging to the subjects of the national curriculum. So rather than worrying about the lag behind, I know we worry about that, of course we do, because we're measured in English and that puts an enormous strain on everybody, but try to step back from that and let's think about, okay, what can these children actually do rather than what they can't do, and build on what they can do in order to look at next steps. So in terms of coming to your kind of how can you support generally, I'd say I've got some key areas here to think about. One is think about the language demands of your lessons or activities. What vocabulary do children need to access them, and can you create additional support that makes words explicit? Think about how you can make the activities that you're sending home talk-based rather than writing-based, even if that might mean talking with a sibling or peer-to-peer by phone, even though that's not ideal in terms of language models. It does at least allow for oral development of ideas before writing, for example. Can you make activities visual of themselves or support with visual cues? So could, for example, children make ebooks using the Open University's app My Story, which is great for making little films, not films, but books using photos and putting your own text in. Could they make short films about themselves to demonstrate understanding? Can you draw on graphic novels? Raintree.co.uk have a great number in English, and Mantralingua, who we've mentioned, I know in previous times on the previous webinar, have got currently giving free access to a lot of dual language text in many languages that could be really useful for supporting where parents lack proficiency in home languages but where the school want to try and support home language development. You've touched on a really important point, and I've actually seen it coming through in the chat line as well while we've been talking, and that's this idea that there are some parents and children now we're seeing increasingly in schools who are neither proficient in what we might describe as their home language nor in English, and yes, that is a real challenge, particularly perhaps amongst our UK-born EAL children. And I guess our advice in that case is that the main support that the school can give is to really focus on advancing proficiency in English and to make that your focus, whilst also encouraging parents where possible to build use of home language at home if that's likely to be the stronger language. Not a perfect answer there, but thanks for raising that because it's so important. And one final resource to give you, and it sounds like it's from a very long way away because it is, but actually Constant was talking about the fact that there's not a lot of built-in EAL guidance in national curriculum documentation in England at the moment, in the UK at the moment, beg your pardon. New Zealand has an ESOL support site, esolonline.tki.org.newzealand.nz. Silvana's just put it in the chat line for you there. And I know it sounds like a weird, rather out there resource, but every time I look at it, I think this is great. It's got a lot of resources in there that appear to be free to access to go and have a look. So I hope that gives you food for thought, but thanks for your multi-headed question there, which I'm sure will have been helpful for everybody.
Thank you, Naomi. And a reminder that Naomi is a primary specialist, so the questions that we are now asking Naomi are all primary or early years related. So Yola and Yvonne are asking similar questions, so we put those two questions together for you, Naomi. What ways could support be given to children, to new entrants to English in Key Stage 1? And how can I best support EAL beginners aged 3 to 6 years through online learning?
Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of a plug here for the EAL mesh guide that I mentioned earlier, and you've got the link for, just because it has kind of lists of ideas for for new to English learners in spoken English, reading and writing. So you might find that useful, the kind of headlines that we put together. And among those, for example, would be finding ways in which children can respond to tasks through something pictorial or graphic rather than in writing, because writing's not going to be there yet. Using ebooks to familiarise children with stories and story structure while they're very young, thinking about ways of making again that visual rather than written, and also using ebooks at the moment in both home languages and English, remembering that we really want to build, or we want families to be building proficiency in home languages as well as English, because it's that foundation in the home language that's really going to support the acquisition of good English, and that's why the previous questioner had raised that all-important point about that when that's problematic. So really encouraging home languages and English in early years, very much so. When you get back face-to-face, think about things like speaking frames. Speaking frames are a precursor sort of writing frames where children work with age-appropriate and proficiency-matched texts in order to build up spoken English rather than written English. A useful website here for resources for you both might be racingtoenglish.co.uk. That's a nice one that I know Camille recommends as well at secondary, so just a generally good website. Don't forget phonics for your early years children. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that, which is an essential part of introducing EAL learners to the way English language works. And phonicsplay.co.uk is a great site for that, and a lot of schools are using that one and its sister site Spelling Play. Do remember for EAL though, and Yvonne touched on this in our last webinar, and she rightly reminded me of this, that when we're teaching phonics with EAL, that new words need to have relevance for the children. They need to be about things that they're currently experiencing. Introducing a word which is meaningless to them conceptually is going to be really problematic. Also find out about their home languages. Are there some sounds that are either the same as in English or which don't exist in the home language? Because knowing this can really support you in adapting the usual model of introduction of letters and sounds that we might do in a different order than we do for monolingual English speakers. Finally, because I've got two questions here and it's about early years and so on, I'd like to direct you to a number of resources that were created during pre-2010, in fact, by the Primary National Strategy. I know that sounds like going back to the Ark for some of you, or it's probably even pre-teaching for some of you. But between the years of 2003 to 2009, there were lots of things published by the government at the time, which have all sorts of interesting things in them. And the one that Yvonne might want to draw on in particular is called Supporting Bilingual Children in the Early Years. So it's Primary National Strategy, and it's 2007 is the publication date on that one. You can find that on the NALDIC website. You can also find it at a great online repository called DERA, DERA.ioe.ac.uk, and that's put together by UCL Institute of Education, and it's like a repository of all the government guidance that was produced several decades ago, which is old, is certainly no longer curriculum specific, we know that, but is in the kind of older but gold category, in which I recommend it to my students quite a lot, and just get them to ignore the references to curricula that are no longer current. So I hope that gives you enough of a list to be going on with. Thanks for those questions.
Thank you. Another one from Jenny, Naomi. How can I support a non-English speaking child who has learning difficulties in his home language? Some background: he's 10 years old, been in our school for 6 months and is struggling to communicate. He speaks in his home language but cannot read or write in his home language.
Okay, thanks for bringing this question to us, Jenny. This is a really complex one because it sits at the confluence of SEND and EAL, and any of us dealing with that know it's very complex. So I actually forwarded your question to expert colleagues I have at Reading to get some advice. But just to also do a little bit of a plug for Reading has a public engagement wing called Bilingualism Matters at Reading, and you can email them for advice about this sort of thing. So that's bilingualism.matters@reading.ac.uk. But the thing that's really important, and my colleague Theo Reid, who's a clinical language tutor on our speech and language therapy programs, said, and I was going to say as well, is obviously this child needs assessment and probably a referral to an educational psychologist once you're back at school. I know that doesn't help you now, but a child of 10 who's got specific language disorder alongside EAL needs a lot more than the average teacher can probably manage, albeit that you're trying really hard here, which is brilliant. But you do need to know more precisely what the learning difficulties are and get that assessment. In the meantime, a pragmatic response, while we're not able to perhaps access those, also from Theo and also from Professor Ludovica Seratrice, who's a linguist at Reading. They both say you might look at creating a communication book or pages using widget symbols. There are quite a lot of resources online, and you could start with a small range of symbols and increase as progress is made. Ludovica tells us about a site called communicationmatters.org.uk, which I think Silvana's got the link for, and that's useful as well. I've got seen some great things coming in the chat line here, though, so do have a look at that as well. Wonderful experts in the audience as well. Finally, to let you know that Bilingualism Matters at Reading are developing resources to help teachers and FLTs together with just this problem. In fact, we ran a special training day last year and we're really hoping to run one this May, but obviously can't, and that's me and my colleague Theo Reid. And we're going to put together a summary of materials on the Bilingualism Matters at Reading website specifically to help teachers working at this tricky interchange of SEND in terms of specific language and communication difficulties and DAL. So watch out for that. And if you don't see it, can't find it, email me and I can let you know things. I'm always happy to hear from people. Thank you very much. Thanks. I hope that's helpful,
And
Jenny.
Finally, Daniela has two questions. Number one, what advice can we give to parents to support EAL preschoolers? And two, if nurseries will remain closed until the end of the summer term, how can parents support their children transition to school?
Hi, Daniela. This is a challenging one when children are so young, families are doing very different things with them and so on, and we want to be thinking, I guess, about readiness for school, but not necessarily for all of them. So again, referring back to the guidance I referred to in an answer to 2 questions ago, there's this PNS Primary National Strategy guidance, supporting bilingual children in the early years. I think that has some really nice kind of pointers for practitioners, both in terms of how you work with children yourself in EAL settings, but also about how you might work with parents. So that's a useful one, and that's the one that's available from DERA.ioe.ac.uk. I've got a couple of things here which actually Silvana drew my attention to this morning, so thank you to Silvana for these. And one is called the Easy Peasy app. It was recommended on the radio this morning. It's for families and teachers, and it's got game-based activities for young learners that may work really well for EAL learners because really visual and app-based and phone-based, and therefore getting around the phone problem. So easypeasyapp.com. And another one is ParentKind. Thank you, Annette. I'll slow down a bit. ParentKind.org.uk, which is also been advertised as a good one on the radio this morning. Again, going to Bilingualism Matters at Reading, we have advice for parents on using home languages during lockdown. So far, we've translated this into Italian and Spanish. So again, Bilingualism Matters at Reading website. Again, I'll send Silvana a link to that so she can put it into the chat line. And in it, we advise parents of young children, talking about our preschoolers again, to continue speaking in home languages rather than in English because that is their norm, or if that is their norm, and because, I can't say it enough, a strong foundation in a home language will give children a better chance of developing English once they start in mainstream schooling. Last bit of your question, you talk about transition to school. I can't really answer how to advise parents on this, but I imagine that all my colleagues who are in school right now will be worrying a lot about how they manage the transition of their youngest children who are going to start in reception in September, we hope, and for whom that transition is so important. So I would advise parents to be looking out for or actively contacting the schools to which their children are going to go in September in order to see what's going to happen for them, rather than trying to give a kind of blanket advice around that one. But I hope that's all helpful for you.
Thank you very, very, very much, Naomi. And now, before I ask Camille to answer some questions, just a quick message for Constant. Constant, our technical support is contacting you in private message to help you with your mic. So, Camille, we have a couple of questions for you, if you mind, if you don't mind coming and turning on your camera. Thank you.
Hello.
So, Camille. Thank you. The first question from Sandy. A reminder that Camille is our secondary specialist. Sandy, how can we help EAL families support their children at home during...
Thank you, Sandy, for this question. I'm thinking, first of all, many families of learners with EAL will themselves have the English language barrier. So if that's the case, it is a good idea to remind them that they can help their learners in their work using their first language. As Naomi has just mentioned, the development and maintenance of the first language is of great help when we are developing the second language. So many parents might perhaps not always be aware of this link, and so perhaps think, particularly at this time, that they cannot be of much help, but this is actually not true. So since learning at school involves learning about the subject content, they can definitely be involved in supporting their children, and so we might want to encourage this. It will be good to establish a communication with the parents. During this time, they might have as many questions for you as you do for them. So there are some bilingual apps. Now, obviously, they would need to be kind of vetted by your school in terms of security and that sort of thing. However, for instance, just as an example, there is a chat translator for WhatsApp, so that uses Google Translate. So you define the language, you define two languages, that's of yours and whoever you're speaking to, and that message will be instantly translated into the other language. And what it also means is that the parents can keep writing in their language, and then that will be translated into English. Now, obviously, Google Translate is not a perfect tool. We know that, but I think if we remember to keep our grammar and syntax and vocabulary relatively simple, it should do the job of communication. So, as I said, there might be issues with security of that particular app in terms of your own school. But this is just to say, this is just one example, and it is the technology is available for that. And finally, I think I would just like to mention that when I was an EAL coordinator myself in secondary schools, I would regularly organize EAL evenings for parents, essentially parents' evenings, but only for parents of EAL learners. And so I was just wondering if you would be able to try and organize something like that for parents of your learners during this current time, say using something like Zoom. Again, it would depend on what is actually possible in terms of organizing it securely, but you would be able to share your screen with others. Some versions of PowerPoint, especially the new ones, actually allow you to display captions and translating them into a language that you choose on the go, so to speak. So you might perhaps ask parents to send you questions ahead of the time and then try to answer them. And of course, just to finish, to wrap it up, I obviously understand that doing all of these things takes time. So I'm not saying that you should be doing all of these things at the same time, but this is just some things I think to think about.
Thank you, Camille. The second question is from Sue, and it's similar to the one we asked Naomi, but with a secondary focus. Please give advice on how to teach computer illiterate secondary age children with illiterate parents in either English or Arabic. They're currently unable to access any homework, and having missed 5 years of primary school, they're already way behind. They cannot download, upload, or read or send any documents by email.
Yeah, I think I thought that question is probably as tough as they come. Well, in the first place, I was wondering if your school is able to provide any kind of small, simple device such as a tablet to your learners, because I wasn't sure if when we say that they are computer illiterate, does it mean that they're also kind of mobile or tablet illiterate? Probably not. I was thinking this is probably in terms of larger computers and all of the software on there. But if they are able to use mobile devices, then tables and phones could be used, and but there might need to be some kind of introduction into how to use them for the purposes. So, in fact, I think Naomi has already mentioned that the videos, we can create videos on these devices, and so perhaps a short video can be produced for them, or even some kind of a short photo-based guide that is printed to try and explain how to do this. For example, how to send an email from that particular device, just so they can watch this and try to replicate it. It strikes me that these learners will need to learn about technology almost as much as the English language, particularly at this point. Now, the second thing to mention, again, I keep coming back to Google Translate, because Google Translate has an option of even if you are not able to read the language, and even if you're illiterate in your first language, then you can still click that button that is going to read that to you. So that might be of use, essentially to listen to what the translation into Arabic is. And obviously, Google Translate apps are available for mobile devices as well. And then once those kinds of things are in place, at least the basics, then you could obviously start using some applications. For example, there's Quizlet.com for teaching vocabulary with images. So we could then use them. And the activities on that website include flashcards, pronunciation, game-like activities. We mentioned how engaging the different games are for EAL learners and for all other children. And so all of these tasks would be obviously considerably easier if there was another learner at your school. And actually, I was nodding when Naomi mentioned community, local community. So if there are other people around who do speak Arabic and better English, then they would be able to communicate those basic needs online to learners and the families, of course. And so the question is, I suppose, at the end, are we able to enlist someone to help us with this? Yeah, so
thank you, Camille. The next question is from Shamso, and the question says, I'm a learning support assistant for a secondary school, and I wanted to know that while in the time of lockdown, how can I help the students? I am frustrated and clueless about what I can actually do. Do you have any advice or ideas?
Yeah, so I was Thank you for this question, Shamso. I was thinking actually in terms of trying to mirror what you would do in a regular classroom in typical times, and then how we can try and do the same in the current situation. So in the real classroom, we either would be typically supporting learners with English language acquisition in the classroom and understanding the English input when they are in a lesson and listening to a teacher or on a task. Or perhaps they would be in a kind of one-to-one situation or small group. So the question is, can we do any of this online? So for instance, let's imagine that a learner's task is to write a piece of writing on some kind of a topic. Can they do so using something like Google Docs? Google Docs offers this kind of live collaborative writing approaches. So you would be able to see what they are actually writing as they are doing so. And so that means that you would be able to highlight and comment on your learners' work in real time, supporting them as they do so. And so now, obviously, this would require collaboration with teachers and parents, because you would need to know when exactly they would be doing this. Then there are other tools online. There are tools such as collaborative whiteboards. So, for example, there's one which is at miro.com. And there are plenty of other ones online. So then you are essentially able to draw on them. Often they come with apps for different devices. So you can draw shapes, images, and you can basically collaborate with them in real time. So that would mimic, at least to some extent, the kind of things that you would be doing in the classroom if you are supporting them in that way. And then on the same note, communication. So you communicate with other teachers that you would normally be supporting in the classroom. And the question is there a way that you could get the work of the EAL learners that they are currently engaged in as well? And finally, it might be possible for you to have one-to-one conversation with your learners via something like Zoom or another kind of. I know that in some schools it is a difficulty, but hopefully you're not in that position. So that could replicate those one-to-one or small group lessons if that's part of the job as well. And then one thing that is typical so using the digital resources is impossible because learners could share their screen with you, so you would be able to see what they're actually doing, and you can provide guidance as they go along in the same way that you can do this via Google Docs. And the last thing I would like to mention is that if your learner is in a larger class meeting on a platform such as Zoom, and that's the way that lesson is being conducted, then obviously there will be all other learners in the class. Well, most of these platforms, such as Zoom, Skype, and Teams, and all of those kinds of platforms, they enable you to have private conversations with others. So perhaps you'd be able to offer support to your learners and monitor their understanding of the content by being one of the people in that kind of webinar kind of room, but through a private channel open throughout the session. And again, you could use text, images, link to websites, and other resources, and you could just sort of establish that kind of communication. It's obviously probably slightly poor equivalent to what the real thing actually is, but we can do at least with what we have available for us. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thank you very much, Camille. And now over to Yvonne. And Yvonne, I have a couple of questions for you, if you would like to show us, turn your camera on and mic on. Thank you, Yvonne. Excellent. So we've got a question from Francis. What online activities are good to use at home for pupils at stage 2 of EAL?
Thank you, Francis, for your question. When I was thinking about your question, actually, there were a number of things came into my head. Rather than just online activities that you can engage in, there are a number of websites that you can refer to that give very good support for vocabulary development and also for the support of grammar. And those are linked to British Council websites. One of them is called learnenglishkids.britishcouncil.org. I'll put those on at the end of these questions. And they help to support younger learners in aspects of using language to, for example, to design a hero, or there's different songs, or there's text that they can use in order to explore, you know, different, what the Romans did at certain times. And so there's different fairy stories that you can access. And this website is actually very good in terms of word games, and also building in much more kinesthetic approaches with crafts. So for younger learners, there's good activities within that British Council website. There's also One Stop English, which has activities that support the types, if you're only looking for the types of activities that develop certain parts of language. For example, how to develop vocabulary. And there's also the graphic organisers that can be used as a workbench in order to support the development of vocabulary. Because I think it's Nora McWilliams' book, What's in a Word, really helps to support the teachers that I work with in how you know a word in its entirety. So it's not just about the denotative meaning of the word, it's about the connotations of it, what a word doesn't mean, what it does mean, and it helps to build up the story of the word rather than just a single meaning that you can attach to it. So it's looking more at how you develop language as a whole, and to support language for participating in society rather than just in a school context. So it's a really good book by Nora McWilliams. There's also the other ways in order to support online, and although we're talking about using graphic organisers as a workbench, there's also picture books that can be used as a resource, and those are linked to exploring how we develop literacies for multilingual learners, and it helps to draw on first language, and it helps to explore how you might communicate certain things within a second language as they're operating between the two, particularly if they're at the beginning of English language learning. And some of those books that I recommend to you are actually free online. Sean Tan's book, The Arrival, he also has one called The Red Tree, and he has a site. I'll put the link for his site on at the end of this question, or these questions that I'm being answered, in order to explore those. And there's an excellent book also by Amnesty International called Azzy In Between, and it's about a refugee pupil who came to live in the UK and what was put in place for them, and helps learners to explore their own perceptions, their sense of belonging, their sense of culture shock. And within that, the activities that can be linked to these that are not necessarily online, although they can be accessed online through graphic organizer work, are more project-based that you can set up for pupils on the platforms that have been mentioned earlier. I won't go through what platforms you can use again, because Camille and Naomi have referred to those. And it's about how to produce reflections with these texts in order to produce multilingual literacy development, and it's reflections on the stories either in first language or second. It's exploring what causes and brings a sense of belonging, and so you're dealing not just with language, but you're also looking at how EAL pupils are starting to position themselves within the society that they've come to. Especially if they're feeling cut off from their peers at the moment, where a reflective task can be something that's helpful either in first language or second. And it helps to take us beyond just a comprehension focus, because a lot of our exams and a lot of our activities in schools or questions or textbooks focus on reading on the line, or they either engage in an analysis of the text, which takes them maybe to reading between the lines. But it's also how we read beyond the line, how we read beyond the text and draw in our own personal experience of that. And it helps us to bring in questions that support pupils in identifying fake news or certain perceptions or positionings within text. And this can be used for very young learners and also in secondary schools and for older learners. So, for example, if you take a book, Into the Forest by Anthony Brown. We've used this with student teachers for our secondary pupils as well as those within primary. And it helps to explore texts across borders, because culturally fairy stories have very different endings in different cultures, and I learned that when I went to live in Southeast Asia. And it also helps you to explore questions about gender, because in this story and in this text, Little Red Riding Hood is depicted as a boy, and so you can start to explore feelings about whether boys can experience fear. How is the boy constructed in the story that's different to the way the girl was constructed in traditional stories? And these all can be put at question levels for the various levels of learners that we work with. Other questions that might we be able to explore with text that you can do on different platforms. You can produce these questions in writing. You can read stories and pose questions if you make a video. Are looking at, within this text, whose voice is missing, what gaps are within the story, who's not speaking and who's not getting a voice, why might that be? Other questions are, what actions could I take? And that's from the youngest learner to the oldest. And it's to help to develop the kind of participation in how we think about text, along with the way that we're supporting the development of English, because that in itself helps to develop language as they look for the language in order to take care of that. So who wins, who loses in the text, who's the text written for, and how can I counter text? How can I speak against the text that I don't necessarily agree with in order to provide their own voice? And that brings in the cultural engagement that may be different from something that we have in Western societies. And it opens up engaging with different texts online in ways that help to promote difference in the way that all pupils think.
Much, Yvonne, thank you. And there's a bit of a long question, but I think it's important to get the detail. This is from Becky, and she says, I have a question about a newly arrived refugee student from Syria. She arrived in the UK last November and joined the school in year 10 as a beginner in English. She was settling in, culture shock, silent period, barely able to use a computer, and on the cusp of making friends when lockdown happened. She's now isolated, depressed, and lonely. She has been into school during shutdown, and I have taught her English as her family have a social worker and support from a local charity. Normally this charity would be inviting her and her mother to do lots of social events to meet other families and welcome her into the community, but these have all had to stop. She has a laptop at home and now knows how to access some relevant websites. Can you advise me how I can help her to connect with others in society in a safe way and not to feel so socially isolated whilst continuing to learn?
That's a really important question, and I'm glad you brought it up, and thank you for doing that. I think the fact that you're meeting with her, and my own daughter has been able to do that too in schools, meeting up with children that are from refugee backgrounds. And it's looking at agencies outside of education that are able to support us in facilitating the development of education and how we help the process of transition for these students. I think awareness of transition and also engaging with the pupils that have come from these backgrounds is something that you seem to be supporting with at the moment, which is great. But there's also some organisations that I might suggest that you get in touch with. And one of them is actually up here in Scotland, but has a really good reputation for supporting pupils. And you might have heard of Alison Phipps. And she is one of the professors in Glasgow who works with Refugee and Asylum and Migration Network, and I'll put these links on that I've mentioned to you today at the end. And they also have a Facebook page and keep us up to date on that. And there's also the Refugee Council that has a Facebook and also a website that can help to support teachers and those working with refugees, because some refugees are also carers in the environments that they find themselves for younger siblings. And they've been able to create some, what they call a time capsule, that's a safe space for supporting refugee younger people and also younger pupils. And it's a space where they can come in and talk about either their experiences in lockdown or their experiences as carers in lockdown. And there's also an opportunity for them to contribute to blogs and to read blogs by other people. And so that's where the buddy system, connecting these organizations and having your own agency to speak to them and say, how can we set up safe environments for these pupils to be able to communicate with each other, or even with safe pupils within the school? Because when we looked at our Pupil Voice project that we did with the Bell Foundation, one of the things that all of the pupils, either from refugee backgrounds or from migrant backgrounds, talked about was the buddy systems that their teachers set up for them as being key to their sense of well-being. And so finding pupils within your schools or within your classes that may act as safe contacts for these pupils is something that I know my own colleagues have done working with pupils in this way. So I would look up GRAMNet, that's the Glasgow Refugee Asylum and Migration Network, in order to do that. And there's also a site by Amnesty International that produces resources for working with refugees. I don't know if that's something you'd be interested in. And they have produced resources, and there's a website link to that I think Silvana has the link for. And they have looked at refugees across the world, and it engages in activities that look at myth busting and what a refugee is and what a refugee isn't. And that's good for any pupil, not just those that are refugees. What's in a name? What does your name signify? It's different across cultures. And then different activities and pictures and visuals that they're saying, what do these people have in common, as it starts to look at all the discourse and the ideologies behind children's rights and refugees. And you can bring that right down into a primary level with the resources that are there. And that gives us opportunities then to develop literacy skills for not just focusing on comprehension, which is the basic building block, but also to take activities that can help us to predict, skim and scan and read for deep meaning, but then also reading beyond the text into the life worlds that these pupils will inhabit. There's finally on this one, there is something that my own colleagues and student teachers that we work with have accessed that's been really helpful. And it can be helpful in lockdown when you go out to do your activities or your exercise, but it can also be helpful as we move out of this period of lockdown. And it's looking at outdoor learning, and it's something that we can link with language development. And Silvana has the link for this with Aberdeen Council, and it's looking at how we develop the pupils' ability to engage with sustainability, how food grows, how plants grow outside, how we help them to look at gardens or learning beyond the classroom type activities, and engage in activities that explore questions around climate change, livelihoods. Why does a plant die? So a lot of those questions are linked in these activities that the link has just gone up for. And it helps them to begin their reasoning skills about what might cause this. And these can be done within the safe environments that you're seeking if you get in touch with these links that I've given you. So I hope that gives you some insights into where you might start exploring. I don't have all the answers to that, but it's something very close to my heart, and I hope that it's helpful. The book that I mentioned previously, Azzy In Between, is a really good book for refugee pupils to begin exploring with you, and it opens up a way of producing pupil voice, and hopefully some of those contacts that you make through these networks will enable you to engage with pen pals and that type of buddy system, so that across social networks. I hope that helps.
Thank you very, very much, Yvonne. And Constant, there are a couple of questions for you if you would like to switch on your mic and turn on your camera. Okay, I can see Constant's mic is on. If you can, the closer you can speak to the laptop, the better, Constant, to improve the quality of your sound. If you can speak to me while your camera, just to check your sound.
Hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Perfect. Okay, Constant, if you would like to switch your camera on, yep, and start sharing. I've got a question for you from Dominic, and he says schools have until the end of May to issue predicted grades and then track students within each grade from most secure downwards. My understanding is that EAL students who are still learning English as they are new to the UK would have made greater progress in relation to their GCSE grades than non-EAL students, as they would have been making progress in both their subject and in English. The latter would therefore enable them to access the papers more and would lead to them getting a higher grade than when the schools went into lockdown. The Bell Foundation planning to publish any guidance on this? The short answer is yes. Watch our website next week. We'll publish some guidance. But the question for you, Constant, is
you hear me okay now?
Is there any other guidance available? So what kind of guidance can you give us
right.
in this as well?
There isn't any explicit guidance on this.
Yes, I can hear you well now. Thank you.
That I touched on earlier. It's very little. Can you hear me now? Is it any better? Okay.
You stopped.
I'm not quite sure what's going on with the technology, but anyway, let's let me say that there isn't any official guidance on this anywhere that I can see here. I think the reason for that is that because EAL isn't, if you like, a curriculum subject at all in the current dispensation, so therefore there's relatively little attention paid to it. But let me say this though, the off-call statement says something like this, okay, that this is a document that was released earlier today. Statement. The statement says, for students with English as an additional language, schools and colleges should consider the likely language acquisition a student would have made by the time of the examination, and any increased ability to demonstrate subject content knowledge as part of this increased English language proficiency, as part of this, and reflect this in their judgment. In other words, OFCOR is saying in the time between the start of the closing of schools and the time when teachers are expected to provide a teacher assessment judgment, they should take into account the amount of English that the student would have gained in the 3 or 4 months, and take this into consideration in terms of possible subject content learning. Okay, now I'm going to answer this in 2 ways. Firstly, from all the reliable analysis that we have now in this country, one set by Steve Strand, working on the Welsh data, and one set by the DFE here in England on English data, consistent with the international studies. They all tell you that EAL development in terms of measurable progress is quite slow compared to some other areas of learning. Generally speaking, it's 2 years to move up 1 band or 1 stage, if you like. If you take a 5-band rating scale, to move from 1 to 2, band 1 to band 2, stage 1 to stage 2, if you like, it's normally 2 years in the round. So in the 3 or 4 months that our students would have missed school, of course, I mean, learning doesn't stop, but in many cases, they might be not getting the kind of exposure and practice in the use of English for academic purposes in school in this period. Whatever the situation is, the time period is too short for us to be able to say, oh, well, in this 3 months or 4 month period, they would have gained something like 0.1 of a band or 0.2 of a band movement. That would be unrealistic in relation to our current knowledge of proficiency measurement. We simply don't have that data. And in any case, there are so many variables in this question that looking at 3 or 4 months progress is very, very difficult, even with the best analysis. So the other way to approach this would be to say, in that statement Ofcom makes, there's a strong assumption that the learning of subject content, let's put this in something like in the subject of science or maths or something like this, is closely in lockstep movement with the development of English. Well, there's clearly a relationship between English language proficiency and one's ability to learn anything at all in any content area. But the point is, it's not a kind of progress in locksteps. We know that now from lots of evidence that many EAL pupils, because of their previous learning, their own individual interests, and all sorts of other circumstances that we won't have time to go into, actually have quite a lot of ability in some content areas. And I think many of us as teachers would know that maths is an area where a lot of EAL background pupils tend to sometimes know a lot more and can do a lot more ahead of their seeming English language proficiency. So therefore, the way to look at this is to say, what is it that the pupil can do using all their resources, using whatever language that they have, whatever English language they have. If, for example, you have a colleague who shares a language with a pupil, then maybe encourage the pupil to use that language to show the best they can. But also using other means such as visuals, diagrams, graphics, and so on. And you know, these things are everywhere in some subjects like science. Even in history, you know, timelines, for example, is a good way of representing development of events or, you know, change of situation and so on over time. So the way to do this is to actually make all possible allowances for our EAL pupils to show what they can do in relation to any piece of content and judge what they can do not solely by their ability to use idiomatic English at an age-appropriate kind of way. And I think that's the most, as it were, educationally sound approach in the current circumstances. I hope that makes some sense. So we obviously have to you know, make use of our knowledge of the pupils to make a reasonable kind of prediction as to how much more they would be able to do in English in a time that they have missed school. But that in itself is very difficult to verify, if you like. So we need to kind of express our trust and our faith in the students through their ability to do things with all the languages and with all the other symbolic means such as visuals and signs and tables and graphs and things like that. Okay, so I hope that that sort of provides some sense of understanding as to how we can approach this question. Okay.
Silvana, we can't hear you.
Yes, of course. My mic wasn't on. Sorry, everyone. We're getting to the end, unfortunately, to this webinar, so I will need to stop. So, Constant, would you like to give us a closing thought on behalf of everyone in terms of what was talked about today and, you know, any advice or just a final words on behalf of everybody here at the Bell Foundation and NALDIC?
Yeah, okay. Because my sound was drifting in and out, perhaps I didn't really catch, you know, everything that everybody said. But anyway, what I did catch though was there was a question about the complex issues between EAL and SEN or SEND. I don't know if Naomi mentioned the work by Anne Margaret Smith, and I think colleagues might find her work interesting. She can be found on the web quite easily on Google. And she, in fact, was a keynote speaker at the NALDIC conference last November. And so, in fact, if you go onto the NALDIC website, you would be able to, I think, catch something of what she said there. So that's one thing. The other point about, I mean, several colleagues mentioned loads and loads of really helpful websites. But let me add one, at least one to this, and that is, I was looking around, trying to find out what colleagues in other countries, other Anglophone countries, if you like, might be doing to support EAL students. And I found a couple of websites that are actually quite helpful. One, I think Silvana would put up this on the in the chat box. There's a website that provides quite a neat, concise set of summary points on what they call English language teachers, but we call EAL teachers or EAL pupils in school. For teachers who work with EAL pupils, and you'll find that the document a kind of neat summary, a reminder of the kind of things that teachers can do, but always remember there is a lot of difference in the context between the United States and different provinces or states in the US, and here we are in the UK. But still, some of the pedagogic points are broadly similar. And if you actually look at that document, there's a kind of link to a site called Talking Points. This is very interesting. This is a kind of charitable organization, I think, in the US. It provides a kind of communication facility for teachers to get messages to parents from linguistic minority families. And so, you know, once you sign up, I won't go into details, but once you sign up, you can post a message, and this organization would then forward the message in translation to the families. Now, I can't vouch for the quality, but what I'm saying is this is the kind of thing that we should be thinking about for the future. And also there are other facilities that you will find from all of this for the information from this website. Okay, but in the main, then I think we know enough to support the pupils, even though the tools we have are perhaps not perfect. But let's basically do our best. But in the meantime, also be prepared for, if you like, literally organizing ourselves to make explicit that it's so important to get this part of the curriculum right for our pupils. We're talking about 20% of the school population in England, if nowhere else. And I'm sure it's pretty much the same in Wales and in Scotland and so on. So, thank you very much for Silvana for getting this together for us, and I hope this is useful.
Thank you, Constant. We're going to stop now, but before we stop, I wanted to thank each of you for agreeing to be on the panel, Naomi, Yvonne, Camille, and Constant, and for sharing your expertise so generously with us. Before we close this webinar, I just wanted to remind you that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to a video recording of this webinar and a survey. We will also be putting together all the links that we have been recommending and sharing them with you. Just a reminder of forthcoming events. Coming soon on May the 7th, the Bell Foundation will host a webinar called Introducing the EAL Assessment Tracker. This is a tool that's connected and related and supplements our EAL assessment framework for schools. And on May the 19th at 4 o'clock, that's a Tuesday rather than a Thursday, we will have a webinar with Dr. Olga Kara, who will be speaking to us about how parents can support the home learning and schoolwork of children of English as an additional language pupils. This second webinar will be available to register on our website as from next week. Another forthcoming event, well, a list of forthcoming events that you can get for NALDIC, for the regional interest groups. Please look at the website and that link that I'm showing you right now if you want to find out more about when the RIG meetings will be taking place. And a reminder that the annual conference, the annual NALDIC conference, will be online this year, and it will happen on November the 21st. They will have details coming soon. Please check the NALDIC website for further details. That's there. And a reminder that the Bell Foundation has developed new EAL guidance videos with strategies specific to the current home learning context. So check our website, and also a list of resources with extensive listening, reading and speaking recommendations, both curriculum and language focus. So if you access that link, you will be able to access them all, and we will be updating more every week. And finally, from NALDIC, a reminder that the EAL Journal blog has ideas for teachers and parents of EAL learners during lockdown. So thank you very much again for taking part in today's webinar, and thanks again Naomi, Camo, Yvonne and Constant for giving us your time and sharing your ideas with us so generously. We'll stop recording now, and I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you. And